At the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, if it's on our shelves, it's history.
Kind of comes up. Here is a little piece that you say you've seen before, to the volunteers. And this physician, C.B. Coventry, M.D., ex-president of the New York State Medical School, he has 11 things here that he says that soldiers should be doing. For instance, let your beard grow so as to protect the throat and lungs. Also, to cure and prevent sore feet, rub bar soap on the inside of your stockings. So this comes up every once in a while as a collectible. The circular number 2, do you see that around? Is that a collectible piece?
It's not as collectible as something like that, but
It,
circular number
it
2 in
was
the
printed
medical.
and got out.
It was
Yeah.
a circular, so it's
Yeah.
widely printed. So every
Was it
time,
general order or just a
yeah,
circular?
it was a general order. All physicians ideally would have had a copy. They all didn't, but they're worth that. So when I go into the archives, especially the National Museum of Health and Medicine, the old Army Medical Museum, as you go through each specimen report or case report, you'll see the circulars jammed in there, and references to it. On every case report in the specimen histories, it will say in obedience to circular number 2. So you see it quite a bit. But the originals, I don't know, have you ever come across?
Never seen the original that Hammond put out, but
You know, you mentioned amputations before, Gordy, and you also state in your book that the primary amputation was the basic treatment for gunshot wounds, certainly at the beginning of the war, and maybe throughout. Did the lack of professional medical education before the war lead to an abundance of amputations, or was that the only way for them to go? And was this primary amputation, did that change throughout the war?
well, the cause of the amputation was the instruments of death that the soldiers were using called the mini ball. And once that pointed projectile hit bone and hard substance in the body, it shattered things, and there was no way to put it back together. And that's why the theory came out that they wanted to do primary amputation within the first 48 hours before an infectious process set in, and then you got to amputate to an infectious process, which is going to spread that infection. So the theory was to amputate in a clean area, get that specimens of those shattered pieces of bone out of there, which are a foci of infection.
You brought one here for
Yeah.
us to see. What is this?
It's a specimen from the pathological laboratory that Shauna is talking about, and it's probably a piece of long bone, and it's probably osteomyelitis or necrotic bone, and that was given to a commander at Bethesda when he left the command, probably as a gift. But it shows what those things were. But the problem was the amputation had to be done because of the wounds. You see the pictures of these wounds, and they're just horrific. I have a picture that I do when I give my lecture that you take that into the hospital over here at Northwestern, and the orthopedic surgeon, the vascular surgeons, and everybody else are going to look at that and say, we can't help that, so you're going to have to amputate
Today
that.
as well.
Yeah, there were probably some unnecessary amputations, maybe, but as Hammond and my hero, Jonathan Letterman, came through, and what Letterman set up in his operating area, there were 3 surgeons that worked together as a team, and they would look at the wound, and they would have to concur that the amputation would have to be done.
That's what struck me too when I first went into the case reports, and it would always say, in consultation with my fellow surgeons, we've decided here, and that's one of the most pervasive debates that go on through the war. Is there was this idea that in 1861, a lot of hackers ran to the field and were amputating far too readily. Medicine becomes quite structured after the Wilson Bill puts all of the surgeons under Hammond's authority. And then this is one of the problems. The doctors say because maybe there were too many amputations performed early in the war, people are afraid to amputate. But if secondary infection had a chance to or infection had a chance to develop and you were doing a secondary amputation, 92% cases of pyemia would develop because you're going through this infected tissue. And so you sometimes see the debate between conservative surgery, the efficacy of resection. excision, all these different methods, and they're trying everything, but they do realize by the end of the war, and William Williams Keane talks about it and says it had to be primary amputation, and when done quickly, we saved far more lives. So that was one of the central debates that you see through the war, and he reflects after and said we could have done more. Because I think there's a sense that there were so many amputations, but I think looking back, they said we could have saved more lives had we done it quicker.
Now, the medical and surgical records of the Civil War, these volumes, massive volumes, for a morbidly good time. I think that everyone should look through this. It's fascinating, these huge volumes. And everything is in there, yet it's not. And if everything was, it would be like the OED. And so this is almost like the classic comic of what you found in the files. And so everything that's here is augmented at the Army Medical Museum. Is that correct? That's what you found?
Yeah, I actually, before I did my very first research trip, I went into the library and in Canada actually and said, I'm going to read through the medical and surgical history. And what I got after my week there was the great scope. Everything you can imagine is covered in the medical and surgical history. They touch on everything, so you get a sense of this huge enterprise that was Civil War medicine. And in a way, I agreed with a lot of the published literature that I'd read about the war. Maybe there wasn't this epistemological dynamism that that I later uncovered. I didn't know. And I went for my first research trip to the National Museum of Health and Medicine, and we've talked about that earlier. It's a must for researching these sort of the scientific developments through the war. And I went there and I said to the curator, Michael Rohde, I want to see all the specimen histories. And he brought me he brought me a box, just one box of specimen histories. He goes, I'll bring you this for now because we have just a ton. You can't get through them all. And I looked at one and it was 14 pages and it was handwritten 11 by 14. The cover was specimen histories. And that same the material from those histories were condensed into a little 8-10 line paragraph, just a description of the case and all the questions, all the
case
things.
Of ALH 56.
Yeah, and it was
all
the questions and the things they didn't understand and the things they were trying to do and the debates between each other. All of it was edited out of the medical and surgical history. And I said, it's a different war. it was transformative.
Have those files been used before?
I think so. Well, you've used them, and
when the first books we used, we went to the medical museum, and
so they were known, and historians have used them. For instance, here we have Doctors in Blue and Doctors in Gray, which we all grew up with as classic works, and did they go into the files at any great length? And are these still viable books, by the way?
Well, they didn't use. The curator, Michael Rohde, said to me, I don't know why more historians don't come here, but a lot of historians, haven't made their way there, which is why I was, so glad that I did, because I felt like I could make an interesting contribution. But I think people have tended to rely on the medical and surgical history because it was written and created from these specimen histories. But of course, those are viable books. It's always a good place to start if you're going to begin a project on the Civil War.
They're a good beginning.
Oh yeah, for sure.
They're a beginning primer to study Civil War medicine. And
they would still give someone a good primer even today.
Yeah, and there's pieces in there that, there's a piece in my first book that I wish it wasn't in there. It's called a Medicine Mini with teeth marks in it, and we get rid of that.
No, they are. I think they're definitely good places to begin because you never know what is going to spark an interest and what area is going to spark an interest. And they cover medicine in the North and South. They're nice companion volumes for each other. But then it's Civil War. There's always more to be done.
So your book really is a study of medicine and how the Civil War was a venue for American knowledge, for physicians to learn. Of course, there was never anything like this for physicians to learn. All of a sudden, bodies galore, wounds galore. Wow. I mean, I don't know if they were excited about it because they could learn, but in the midst of the carnage, but there it was. And so Hammett, I suppose, was one of those that saw the efficacy of keeping records. Did most of the physicians go on board this? Was this a whole group, all the Civil War surgeons, were they mainly research geeks, all of them?
No, not at all. So you have prior to the war, there were other educational interventions that sort of started this process. So just under 1,000 of America's elite physicians traveled to what was called the Paris Clinical School. So beginning as early as the 1820s, they would go and study with French leaders of science and medicine. There was access to bodies, access to animals, so they could conduct experiments. But when they got home, when these small group of elite physicians came home, and though the number was small, their influence was large. They wrote letters, they edited textbooks, they held central positions at medical schools, and they were the founders of the AMA, so there were certain drives to try to reform medicine. But overall, on a national basis, it was too difficult to convince the homeopathists, the Thomsonians, the numerous physicians that wanted to hold and keep a practice. So you didn't necessarily have to be able to use a microscope and talk about cells or animalcules or dissect a body. You had to practice good bedside medicine in your community and be trusted. What happened with the Civil War is it revealed the complexity of medicine and disease and maybe some of the problems in American medical education. So these elite physicians, and I was really interested in the civilian allopathic physicians in 61 and 66, those that came in and had hospital positions and were able to use the war and use their newfound experience to be able to educate and develop, and we see a nice hierarchy of knowledge develop. And I think those that were resistant to scientific medicine, you see a second generation, a third generation coming in and really taking advantage of the opportunity. And then you still see those that are saying, I don't have time to prepare a specimen, I don't want to look through a microscope.
I was wondering about that. How did they make time through that carnage too, and trying to keep those alive that had been in their hospitals? How did they find the time to do all of this? I guess they did.
They found the time. There's a volume. George Otis at the very end of the war, who's curator of the Medical Museum, comments on the huge amount of submissions. But it wasn't, their first priority was always treating soldiers, saving soldiers, moving soldiers to the field or general hospitals. That was always priority number one. But then there were times they would have dead rooms in the hospitals or laboratories at home, and there was an interest, and the interest grew because you see physicians that we had not heard about in a scientific capacity prior to the war. Through the war, they're submitting specimens, and that chapter 5 talks about this in my book, and it was my favorite chapter to write because some of them would say in 1862, I don't have time to do this, and by 1865, I have the honor to send you a keg of specimens, including, and so you can see that it's now really become part of the wartime medical culture.